Good evening, and may the peace of Jesus be with us all. I'm Art Laffin, and on behalf of Nick Mealy and Ronnie Fellerath Lowell, Edward Oblang, and the Pax Christi staff, I'd like to welcome everyone to the last session of the Gospel and Nuclear Disarmament Study Circle. I especially want to express my deep appreciation to everyone who has participated in this study circle, as well as to each of our guest speakers for their outstanding presentations. Seth Sheldon, John Deere, Molly Rush, Shelley and Jim Douglas, Joe Gerson, Dean Hammer, Martha Hennessy, Mary Yelnick, Monsignor Reyes, and Coco Kondo. Thank you so much for everything you offered to our study circle. And thanks to Edward, each session has been recorded and can now be viewed by going to the Pax Christi website, Gospel and Nuclear Disarmament Study Circle link, and scrolling to the bottom. I want to give an extra special shout out to Edward for all the incredible work he did behind the scenes to make this study circle happen. I also want to thank Nick and Ronnie for everything that they contributed. Due to this being a virtual study circle, we modified how session 5 tonight would be presented. The overall theme for this session is responding as church to the nuclear threat. As many have inquired during the study circle about what actions can be taken to respond to the nuclear threat, the first part of the session will focus on the actions that can be taken by the wider church and the parishes and Pax Christi communities that we're part of. Our special guest tonight is Marie Dennis, who will be our first speaker. Nick Mealy and I will also speak. After the three of us speak, we will have a breakout session and brief report backs. The rest of our session will include a reading of a discussion article from session 5 and a Psalm of Peacemaking. And Johnny Zakovich and I will offer, and Nick will offer closing remarks. As we have done for each of our sessions, we call to our presence tonight all victims of empire, all who have and continue to suffer and die because of the sins of greed, white supremacy, oppression, racism, violence, nuclearism, and war. We remember these, our sisters and brothers, along with the entire holy cloud of witnesses. I'd like to lift up in a special way Dorothy Day, the co-founder of the Catholic Worker, whose heavenly birthday was yesterday. Compelled by her steadfast commitment to gospel nonviolence, she inspired several generations of Catholics to follow Jesus' way of nonviolence and to resist U.S. nuclear war preparations and work for nuclear abolition. Day's commitment to nuclear abolition was unwavering. Immediately after the U.S. nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, Dorothy was practically a solitary religious voice in publicly condemning this unprecedented atrocity. She was arrested numerous times in the 1950s for protesting compulsory civil defense drills that were conducted to prepare the public for a possible nuclear attack. They believed it was better to risk arrest and jail calling for the abolition of nuclear weapons rather than to cooperate with legally sanctioned nuclear war preparations. In 1965, she joined 20 women and several men from different countries in a 10-day water fast in Rome during the Second Vatican Council to pray that the church would issue a clear condemnation of the means of modern war. The witness of Dorothy Day and those she influenced over the last 7 decades paved the way for Pope Francis to make the unprecedented papal pronouncement in 2017 that the possession of nuclear weapons is immoral. Regardless of what one thinks about Dorothy Day's canonization process, one of the great miracles that can be attributed to her is that she kept the gospel of nonviolence alive in the U.S. Catholic Church throughout the so-called Cold War era, a time during which most of the Catholic hierarchy, either by their silence or actions, accommodated war and the bomb. Because of her exemplary gospel witness and the witness of others like her who followed her lead and were compelled by their own faith to act, There is now a new teaching in the church about the immorality of nuclear weapons and the emerging moral mandate for Catholics to unequivocally reject the just war theory and embrace a new theology of just peace. Let us remember and give thanks to God tonight for Dorothy and all those beloved departed peacemakers, a partial list of whom I highlight in my article on page 108 in The Risk of the Cross. I would like to conclude with several quotes that speak to the theme of tonight's session that can be found on pages 94 and 95 of The Risk of the Cross. Dr. King says, quote, "If we assume that humankind has a right to survive, then we must find an alternative to war and destruction. In a day when Sputniks dash through outer space and guided ballistic missiles are carving highways of death through the stratosphere, nobody can win a war. The choice today is no longer between violence and nonviolence. It's either nonviolence or non-existence. I am convinced that the church cannot remain silent while humankind faces the threat of being plunged into the abyss of nuclear annihilation. If the church is to remain true to its mission, it must call for an end to the arms race." Phil Berrigan says, quote, "In an oddly perverse fashion, the bomb has driven us back to the Bible and has retaught us the Sermon on the Mount. At the center of Christian life is the commandment, thou shalt not kill, and its affirmation, love your enemies." And our brother Daniel Berrigan says, quote, "Our plight is very primitive from a Christian point of view. We are back where we started, thou shalt not kill. Everything today comes down to that, everything." And now I'd ask Ronnie to lead us in our opening prayer.
Let us seek to renew our commitment to follow Jesus, our crucified and risen Lord, by lifting up our lives in prayerful worship before God. And so we pray. Nearing the end of our journey together, we echo the prayer of the blind Bartimaeus. Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on us. Our hearts are both burdened and blessed. The weight of our starving brothers and sisters, the enormity of our nuclear intention, and the ponderous danger of our nuclear arsenals bring us to our knees in prayer. Yet we have hope, Jesus. We have your presence in the midst of our betrayal and denial. We have the promise of your empty tomb. You are going ahead of us, walking in the lead. Help us to follow in your footsteps. Cure our residual blindness so that we too can get up and follow you in the way of servanthood and reconciling love. Help us to recognize the areas of resistance in our hearts that still need your healing touch, and those aspects of our thinking and acting that we have yet to conform to your divine standards. As we reflect now on the path our discipleship should take in this nuclear age, we beg you, turn your loving attention to us as you did to Bartimaeus, and ask us, as you did him, what would you have me to do for you? Having walked with you these weeks, we don't ask for love without risks, but simply, Lord, that we might see. Amen. Now I turn to Nick.
Thank you. Good evening again, everyone. This is a real pleasure for me to introduce Marie Dennis, who probably none of you need an introduction to, but Marie, in any case, I'm going to give you one. We go back quite a ways. I first met Marie in the 1980s. I won't go into that. As many of you know, Marie has been the heart of soul and soul of nonviolence for most of her life. And particularly for 12 years, she served as co-president of Pax Christi International. She is an editor of several books and an author of several books. They should be in your library, particularly the first study circle book, which was called, I can't remember the name, but Marie will remember the name. I have it somewhere here. So I'm going to get off and let my memory recover itself and turn everything over to Marie.
All right. It's really nice to be with you all. Thank you, Nick. It was Advancing Nonviolence is the name of the book. I participated as much as I possibly could in each of the sessions. It's just been a pretty amazing lineup, circle of peacemakers that you've been listening to. Art just named them all. You've been moved by the experience of an atom bomb survivor. You've been inspired and motivated by the stories of nuclear resistors. You've been encouraged by the specifics of the vast civil society struggle to move the world, both nuclear states and beyond, off the deadly trajectory, and challenged by deep reflection on the word of God that relates to the nuclear peril. You've already heard a lot about the root of the Catholic Church over the past 75 years in relation to war and violence, nonviolence, and nuclear weapons. So in many ways, you've, I think, completed the conversation. I'm not sure what I can really add to what you know well and to all that you've heard in these weeks. Perhaps maybe this will be a bit of a refresher. I was asked to speak tonight about responding as church to nuclear weapons. I'll try to do that pretty comprehensively, but also trying to make connections, and we can talk about this if there's time for in your small groups or if there's time for Q&A, that where the connections are between the struggle to eliminate nuclear weapons and the church's move toward nonviolence, which has been a very interesting and I think very connected trajectory. So the church, at least as I understand the church, is global institutions, Pope Francis and the Holy See, Vatican departments like the Dicastery for Promoting Integral Human Development, the Secretariat of State, and all of the diplomatic corps. The church is local, national churches, bishops' conferences that are still part of the institution in a very specific way. And the church, we know, is the people of God in nuclear states, under the nuclear umbrella, and in non-nuclear states, working together in organizations, parishes, and as individuals in local communities, many of whom are trying to end the nightmare related to nuclear weapons. So let me begin there, because I think sometimes when we talk about the church, we think the institution, we think about Pope Francis, and I'll get there. But I think the most important part of this move for nuclear abolition is from the people of God. Mm-hmm. As you know very well, the whole thrust toward the ban treaty, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, came from ordinary people not living in nuclear weapon states, but from around the world who began to recognize that they too were being terribly threatened by these weapons. And you know about that. We can say a little bit more about it later. So Pax Christi International, as you know, has worked for nuclear abolition almost since the beginning of the nuclear age. Most often, or almost always, with other organizations like ICANN, and with campaigns like Back from the Brink and Don't Bank on the Bomb. As you know quite well, I think, Pax Christi member organizations in nuclear states or in states that are under the nuclear umbrella, in the US, in England, Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, Italy, et cetera, Australia, New Zealand, and some others, have been very active in working for nuclear disarmament. In other parts of the Pax Christi world, largely over the years, there hasn't been quite as much activity on this particular issue, although that is beginning to change in significant ways, as the non-nuclear world, as I just said, has taken the lead in bringing the nuclear ban treaty into force. Last week, Pax Christi International, I see Mary Jelinek on the screen, and I suspect Mary was involved in this. Last week, Pax Christi International did a very interesting training of some of our member organizations in Africa to encourage them to encourage their countries to sign and ratify the Treaty on the Prevention of Nuclear Weapons. It's a very significant change, and it is where the energy is around nuclear disarmament right now. So I think it's a very interesting move. In most other countries, or in most countries, attention to nuclear disarmament, I don't think, is very widespread. We know that's true in the United States. Aside from those of you who are very interested, Pax Christi groups working in many different places and so on, there doesn't seem to be a lot of energy in the church or outside the church to address the need to move toward nuclear abolition. I think we know that there's a huge organizing and educational task ahead of us. But I think it's really important for us to remember that we are the church, and that where we are active, there's hope. So hold on to your hope. The second little piece that I'd like to say something about is about the middle ground, about bishops and bishops' conferences, and sort of that whole national, sometimes regional structure. And as you know well about this as well, that picture is pretty thin. There were a number of countries where bishops' conferences spoke out, for example, in support of the ban treaty. In England, in Scotland, in Japan, most especially with the leadership of the bishops in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as you can imagine, there were strong expressions of support for moving toward a ban treaty that would make nuclear weapons illegal. In the United States, I went back and reviewed everything that I could find from the Bishops' Conference in the US about nuclear weapons to do the best I could to represent accurately where the church here has been. And this would be aside from individual bishops who are always and have been strong. As far as I can see it, the USCCB supports the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, supports New START, supports the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, if that ever moves anywhere in the US, supports the Iran deal, and wrote a letter with the Bishops' Conference in the European Union that at about the time that the ban treaty was coming into force or being debated, that called for nuclear abolition, but stayed, I think, very well within the sort of realm of realpolitik, at least in the United States. So there was mention of the Treaty for the Prevention of Nuclear Weapons and of Pope Francis' support for it, but there was not any expression of support from the US Bishops' Conference together. There was an interesting effort, a letter to the editor that you might have seen from Susie Snyder in the Netherlands, calling on the USCCB, the US Bishops' Conference, to, as they are rewriting their socially responsible investment guidelines, that they should make sure that they include in those guidelines the advice and support of don't bank on the bomb, to not invest in nuclear weapons, supporting banks or companies. And then in different ways, in recent years, Catholic leaders, including individual bishops and other Catholic leaders, many heads of women's religious congregations, of men's religious congregations, have spoken out strongly and have acted for nuclear disarmament. I think that it's very easy for the world to forget that that many heads of religious congregations have more responsibility than many bishops do, and yet we turn to the bishops, and they tend to be the spokesperson. So I think I always turn to religious congregations of men and women, but especially women, for some of the strongest statements. Pax Christi International gathered a number of those signatures, including 29 individual bishops and people from all over the world who were religious leaders in other ways in their country, in support when the TPNW, the ban treaty, came into force in the beginning of this year. There was quite a wonderful letter circulated by Pax Christi International. Just a little bit about that. But actually, I think that the great hope right now in the institutional Catholic Church is at an institutional level. Pope Francis, the Dicastery for Promoting Interhuman Development, the Secretariat of State, Holy See Missions, and the Diplomatic Corps in different places. You know the evolution of Catholic teaching on war and violence, and Art was referring to it again this evening. As we go sort of back 150 years, many would say that even the just war tradition contributed in some ways to the articulation of international humanitarian law and to the rules of war as they were developed in the beginning of the 19th century. And in many ways, that has been a reference point as the church has struggled to move to a new place, which they have, thanks be to God, because there was a belief that the church could make a very concrete, practical contribution to the frequency at which countries went to war and the damage caused by war, by promoting the rules of war, if you will. And I think that many in the church still hold on to that sort of, how can we function, they ask, in that world of realpolitik? How do we go into the US Congress or into the State Department or into the White House and call for nuclear abolition? How can we say, deterrence is immoral? We'll be left out of the room. So I think there's a pretty strong holdover. And yet all through the 20th century, a move in another direction was developing, beginning during World War I, when Pope Benedict XV's peace note, as it was known, raised a very serious, if largely ignored, effort to stop what was a terribly brutal war. But certainly in the early decades of the 20th century, and really all through that century and well into this one, the Catholic Church is definitely not known as a peace church. For many decades, pacifism was considered an ethical stance that was only appropriate for individuals. But even beginning as early as Pius XII, and especially with John the 23rd and Pacem in Terris, the official church, the popes and official statements from the church, from the Secretary of State, have increasingly and more strongly articulated an abhorrence of war. As Art said, that was thanks to people like Dorothy Day and others, and Jim Douglas and others you've heard from in these days. Pacem in Terris itself was actually an amazing document. In it, Pope John the 23rd wrote with a depth and clarity that most of us, I think, have missed in that document. Remember that he was writing in 1963, shortly after Gandhi's witness to the power of nonviolence. In what some would call a last will and testament of John the 23rd, a letter to the human family that he loved and understood as one, John the 23rd rejected military force and the so-called peace methodology of nuclear deterrence, because it betrayed the, quote, natural unity of the human family, whose only real basis for peace can be love and the collaboration that goes with it. Jim Douglas, whom you heard earlier, brilliant, in his wonderful book from 1968, The Nonviolent Cross, writes that before Pachamentaris, quote, the last resort for the prevention of injustice was the waging of war. But Pope John's insistence on the human capacity to grow in love and truth ruled out war, in his estimation, as beneath the human spirit, so that last resort could only be the resistance of self-suffering love as practiced and perfected by Gandhi. That was 1968 that Jim wrote that. And it was reflecting on a very strong current that John the 23rd had articulated. An intense debate on war and peace, and in particular on the indiscriminate nature of nuclear weapons and on whether deterrence was morally justifiable, took place during the Second Vatican Council. In Gaudium et Spes, the final document of the council, the council spoke powerfully on the peace issue with its clear and unqualified condemnation of total war, its support for the legal right of conscientious objection, its affirmation of the primacy of conscience in every act of war, and its praise for non-violent resistance as for the vindication of rights. At the same time, it maintained a government's right to a military defense in the nuclear age, once every means of peaceful settlement had been exhausted. It was the little bit that I've followed about that debate in the last part of the Second Vatican Council was that it was both intense and really interesting, with some very powerfully articulated arguments against deterrence and so on. Very interesting. But then John Paul II in 1982, in his address to the United Nations during the disarmament conference there, said, quote, in current conditions, deterrence based on balance, certainly not as an end in itself, but as a step on the way toward a progressive disarmament, may still be judged morally acceptable. And as you know, the US Catholic bishops in the challenge of peace maintained that thread of strictly conditioned acceptability of deterrence. I was just reading some of the chapters of a new book that will be coming out before too long about Bishop Tom Gumbleton's journey in the church. And there was a wonderful chapter on his engagement in that process and about the very important and very real participation of people like yourselves, of Pax Christi members all over the country and of others in shaping that document and trying to move it to a place where it really moved us beyond an acceptance of deterrence of nuclear weapons. It was my memory of Pax Christi. I began connecting with Pax Christi US probably in the early to middle 80s. And from then until 2000 and whatever it was, 14, when the Vatican began to sound like they might move beyond deterrence, one of the main efforts of Pax Christi USA, as a lot of you will remember, was to try to get the church to stop accepting deterrence as a morally acceptable strategy for defense, which is, as we all know, absurd. By the end of the 20th century, the church was also giving some renewed attention to the effectiveness of active nonviolence, even as a tool for public authorities to use. So you will remember, some of you, the 1993 10th anniversary statement of the Challenge of Peace that was called The Harvest of Justice, in which the bishops wrote, nonviolence consists of a commitment to resist manifest injustice and public evil with means other than force, These include dialogue, negotiations, protests, strikes, boycotts, civil disobedience, and civilian resistance. National leaders, they said, bear a moral obligation to see that nonviolent alternatives are seriously considered for dealing with conflict. So my sense is that from the amazing example of Gandhi's struggle, of the struggle of the people in India, that was a nonviolent struggle, the example of Dr. King and the civil rights movement and all of the training and preparation and engagement of people across this country in the civil rights movement, on and on, to the witness of the people power revolution in the Philippines and the reality of what happened in Eastern Europe and with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the falling of the Berlin Wall and so on. It was impossible by the late 80s or early 90s for them to not think again about what nonviolence could accomplish. So it was interesting because I think that they were still tending to say that absolute pacifism was a personal option that was inspiring and very appropriate, but that maybe nonviolent approaches could be effective in providing the kind of protection that a government needs to provide to the people living within their realm and so on. So you began to see just a little more opening, but the just war tradition stayed right in the middle of the table, and it was there until very recently. I'm sure someone of another speaker has mentioned this, but I am so proud of Pax Christi USA because in 1998, on the 15th anniversary of the Challenge of Peace, Pax Christi USA got 75 US bishops to specifically, concretely condemn nuclear deterrence. They said nuclear weapons are incompatible with the peace we seek for the 21st century. They cannot be justified. They deserve condemnation. This is a moral challenge, a legal challenge, and a political challenge. Strong words that tended to get lost along the way, but very powerful. 75 US bishops said that. In 2007, not to skip over Pope Benedict XVI, because I've been surprised to go back and retrieve some of what he said. For example, in 2007, he said, love of one's enemy constitutes the nucleus of the Christian revolution. And a few years later, he said, Jesus came with only the strength of love, totally without violence, even to the point of going to the cross. This is Jesus' true message. Seek peace with the means of peace and leave violence aside. Not what I necessarily always heard from Benedict XVI, but very strong. And then there's Pope Francis, and Art mentioned what Pope Francis has been doing, and you know that picture well. He's decried the world, repeatedly decried that the world was in a third world war fought piecemeal. He called for the world to transform our conflicts without violence. He emphasized integral ecology, that the natural world has intrinsic value and is also a victim of war and violence. He's highlighted the tremendous profit in war making and in marketing and trafficking in weapons, and he has pleaded with the world to declare a moratorium, particularly during the pandemic, but he was calling for that before. He's called even the possession of nuclear weapons morally unjustified, and he has moved the just war tradition off center stage, way back on a shelf in the back of the Vatican. I don't think it's quite out of the room yet, but it's pretty close. So, as you may remember, in 2014, he made the Vatican made this first move in the direction of declaring nuclear deterrence unacceptable from a moral perspective. He during the 2014 Vienna Conference on the Humanitarian Consequences of Nuclear War, there was a message sent from the Holy See that was read at the conference, and that began to point in that direction. As you know, then in 2017, Mary noted this in her talk a couple of weeks ago. In 2017, Pope Francis literally said, peace building, sorry, I just lost that. You know that quote. He moved even the possession of nuclear weapons off the table as legitimate. There's something really important about this move that Pope Francis repeated it in Hiroshima and Nagasaki when he was there for the 75th anniversary. He's really held firm. And I think that it is a very interesting element of that in doing that, which he did prior to the main discussion around the ban treaty, the Treaty for the Prevention of Nuclear Weapons, that whereas so often the official church, certainly in this country and in other places as well, was very worried about being in the debate, being in the political debate, functioning in a place of real politique. And as long as the church agreed that nuclear deterrence was conditionally acceptable on the way to disarmament, they could not support the negotiation of a ban treaty that would make the possession of nuclear weapons illegal. And so as Pope Francis began to move the marker on what the church had always been saying, he opened the door for the church to be very active in the negotiation of the TPNW, and was the first state, as Mary said, to both sign and ratify it, which is pretty inspiring. It seems to me that in the nuclear age, the coming together of a move beyond nuclear weapons and a move toward nonviolent options is essential. That the nation states, countries, leaders do have an obligation to protect the people that they are within their space, in their country, in their county. But what we have failed to do is to invest in, we've only invested in the most violent weapons and continue to move down that pathway. Whereas I think now the church is actually beginning to recognize that a shift to a nonviolent paradigm might be possible, might be effective, and might still meet the requirements of people of faith and the church to engage in the political arena. Many years ago, and I'm going to finish with this, Jesuit peacemaker Father Dick McSorley wrote, "The taproot of violence in our society is our intention to use nuclear weapons. Once we've agreed to that, all other evil is minor in comparison. Consent to the presence of nuclear weapons in our world not only accepts the risk of a nuclear conflagration in the future, but also undermines the ethical foundations for the common good and for a global ethic rooted in nonviolence." So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Marie. Wonderful. Now we're going to talk about what we can do. And I'm going to start off with Art. Art, you're on.
Okay. Well, I very much want to thank Marie for everything that she shared. I'm deeply grateful and inspired by her life-giving, steadfast witness to gospel nonviolence. Thank you so much, Marie. There are several things that I'd like to offer regarding how we respond as church to the nuclear threat. A lot of what I will share is taken from chapter 5 in the appendix 5 of the book, titled Nuclear Disarm is Possible If We Have Faith. So the first thing I want to share is that while the challenge of overcoming the nuclear peril is indeed great, it is not insurmountable. Throughout history, we have seen examples of people and movements who were compelled by faith and conscience to overcome what seemed like insurmountable challenges, and Marie identified some of them. Slavery was abolished, legal segregation ended in the United States, and the Berlin Wall came down. Transformation is possible, miracles can occur. The healing miracles that occur in Mark's gospel and other gospel accounts have happened because people had the faith to believe that Jesus could in fact heal them. This is the kind of indomitable faith that we follower of Jesus need in our work for disarmament and nuclear abolition. I submit that if we in our church are willing to follow Jesus' mandate of nonviolence, even to the point of risking the cross, and believe with all our hearts what Jesus said to the father of the convulsed boy, that all things are possible for the one who has faith. And we act on this radical faith, the miracle of disarmament of hearts and weapons and nuclear abolition can happen. I, along with other plowshares activists and many other peacemakers, know such miracles can take place because we were able to literally begin the process of real disarmament. For me, I experienced such a miracle in 2 plowshares actions directed at the Trident nuclear submarine, one account of which I'd like to briefly share. On September 4th, 1989, 6 peacemakers and I carried out the Thames River plowshares action in New London, Connecticut. We were able to swim in canoe to the docked USS Pennsylvania, the 10th Trident, and hammered and poured blood on the hull. 3 of us, including myself, were able to climb on top of the submarine where we prayed for the abolition of nuclear weapons. From aboard this most destructive weapon, I believed then and I believe now that if people have the faith to believe that disarmament is possible and act on that faith, that nuclear swords of our time can be turned into plowshares. Signs of hope do abound. After 76 years into the nuclear age, the most important global sign of hope, which Marie referred to, has been achieved in the ratification of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons by 56 nations, thereby making nuclear weapons illegal under international law. However, as we all know, there's still a long way to go to get the 9 nuclear nations to ratify. The task at hand is indeed daunting due to the fact that the US political, corporate, and military powers do not want to give up nuclear weapons because they are used to maintain global military superiority, to dominate other nations and protect so-called strategic vital interests, which really means to maintain and control resources. The US Catholic Church and all churches have a crucial role to play in enacting the miracle of disarmament and nuclear abolition by implementing Pope Francis's declaration that the possession of nuclear weapons is immoral and must be abolished. Heeding the admonition of the Habakkuk that humanity and nuclear weapons cannot coexist, and calling on the US and other nuclear nations to ratify the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. The church needs to heed the example of the late Archbishops Leroy Matthiessen and Archbishop Hundhausen. And it needs to follow the example of so many nonviolent resistors who have appealed to the consciences of the powers that be to abolish nuclear weapons. Martha Hennessy said in her presentation that we need desperately a confessing church. And we thank God for the example of people like Bishop Tom Gumbleton at 91, who is still actively proclaiming the gospel of nonviolence. As followers of Jesus, we have a lot of work to do. The church needs to understand what Bishop Matthiessen said when he appealed to the workers at the Pantex nuclear power plant, at the nuclear weapons plant in his diocese. quote, in the name of God of peace, quit your jobs. In making this appeal, he said he would try to offer financial assistance to any defense worker who might quit. And so, as followers of Jesus, we, the church, and as members of Pax Christi, must do persistent outreach to our local bishops, our pastors, and other clergy and laity, and urge them to take concrete actions. Some of which I would say are: call on all Catholic soldiers in the nuclear chain of command to refuse orders to use nuclear
Do I need to
weapons.
spray the pan or can I just put it on?
Call on all Catholics to refuse to be involved in the building, maintaining, and paying for nuclear weapons. Call for the USCCB to make a bipartisan appeal for the economic conversion of all arms manufacturing facilities to non-military production. Call on your local bishops and priests in your parish to ask the USCCB to appeal to the Biden administration to ratify the TPNW. Call for an immediate halt to the 30-year, $1.7 trillion upgrade of the nuclear arsenal now underway, and redirect this money in the fiscal year 2022 $750 billion US military budget to eradicate poverty and meet urgent human needs in this pandemic time, and to enact the Green New Deal. There are two other things to also consider. As you know, the Risk of the Cross is intended to encourage followers of Jesus to engage in prayerful gospel study about the absolute threat nuclear weapons pose for all of God's creation, and lead people to take action for disarmament. Now that you have been involved in this study circle, each participant is prepared and certified to help start a new study circle in your parish or with your Pax Christi group using the Risk of the Cross. I strongly encourage you to start such a group and share with others what you have learned from this study circle. If you can initiate a study circle, Nick and I can assist you in whatever way you need help. If you need more training, we can help you. Also, whatever you can do to help promote the use of the book with other parishes in your diocese, we'd be most grateful. And lastly, if you're not already involved with one of the disarmament groups listed in the resource section of the Risk of the Cross, see pages 125 to 123 to 125. I strongly encourage you to join and support one of these groups. And if you aren't doing so already, I also encourage you to help organize a regular peace vigil at an arms manufacturer, military base, congressional office, or federal building near you. And now I'm going to turn it back to Nick.
Thanks, Art. I'm just going to say a couple of things, folks. Pax Christi has long used the three-part rule of prayer, study, action. What we've been doing for the last 6 weeks is prayer and study, and we're going to end with prayer in a bit. But let's talk about the action. You've heard some very good, suggestions from Art right now. I'm going to pull up a couple of ideas for you as well. One is organize advocacy among your friends, among your fellow parishioners. Advocacy how? Art gave you some suggestions. I'll give you a few more. One, Pax Christi in the last year actually had an action alert which suggested that we should write our local bishops and finance councils, the diocesan finance councils, urging them to examine their commitments, their investment commitments, and modify them if they were in fact investing in anything that supported the construction, deployment, maintenance of nuclear weapons. So there is already on the Pax Christi website a sample letter for doing that. That's something you can do. A second thing you can do is write your local bishop and say, we don't hear much about the new teaching on gospel nonviolence, just peace, and against the possession of nuclear weapons. We'd like to hear that. And not only can you write that, some time ago, I did my local Pax Christi region created a 2-page resource sheet, which I hope you can see the first page of. Nuclear disarmament resources, papal statements, the bishops, some books, some videos that might help, and other websites. Now, the first one, Washington Against Nuclear Weapons, is local. It's a coalition here in Washington State where I live that Pax Christi in Washington State has joined. And we're working both to declare nuclear-free zones around the state and indeed encompass the whole state. One state has already done that. I believe that's Oregon. Another thing you can do, the Ground Zero Center currently has a campaign, which Art referred to, of writing letters to military officers who are in the nuclear chain of command and asking them to please disobey any order to launch or otherwise use the nuclear weapons. There are plenty of other ideas. I'm gonna, in a minute here, I'm gonna share my screen again, just very briefly, and then we'll go into a few other things. So I think you can see, these are this is from a slideshow Pax Christi, New Jersey put together. Types of low turnout events for pandemic times. One is a car rally. You get people in cars with signs driving around, I don't know, maybe a central square or roundabout with the message. It's got to be a consistent message. A banner drop, we all know what that is. Something that Pax Christi, Texas did and others have done is projected against the side of a federal building an anti-nuclear message. Chalking sidewalks, days of vigil. One I particularly like is a Jericho Walk, which is exactly what it sounds like. A Pax Christi local group will go to a facility, whether it's the federal building, the a local military facility. In some places, it'll be a nuclear weapons facility of one kind or another. And you march around or walk, because we're nonviolent, we don't march, walk around it 7 times, proclaiming, the walls of nuclear missiles and bombs to come down. And then lastly, a teach-in. Just because we just had the Ignatian family teach-in doesn't mean that our local groups or our regions can't do teach-ins of our own. And that's fairly important for the sake of younger people who aren't as aware of the history of the nuclear weapons. Again, the book is a resource for that. So there's a lot of education and information we have to do. We can increase the impact by expanding our reach with using social media. We can do the slide suggests at-home components. How about just talking to your neighbors, talking to the people in the pews next to you? Visual interest. You may have seen the tweets and Instagram and Facebook posts on the relationship between climate change and nuclear weapons that Pax Christi International released in advance of the COP26. It's good to choose a good time, and there are several good times coming up. In January, there's supposed to be a meeting of the states parties to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And then in March, there's actually going to be the first meeting of the states parties to the Nuclear Ban Treaty, the treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons. And finally, if you have an event, increase the impact through press, email, social media, document the event. You can always bring that back and have a presentation at church or wherever, and do press releases. Karl Rove, and we can steal from that playbook, said, tell them what you're going to say it, and tell them what you just said. We have to inform people. We have to educate people. So that message should go out again and again and again.